Hi everyone, good afternoon. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads. We are on chapter 4 of The Pirate's Treasure in The Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall, Tumtum Nutmeg by Emily Bearn, pictures by Nick Price, and published by Hatchet Book Group Incorporated. The Pirate's Treasure. Remember the kids went camping and the Nutmouses went along because they were afraid something would happen to them. And of course, the general came along. Chapter 4. The children were beside the stream and did not hear the general's grenade go off. But when they looked around a few moments later, they saw the flames dancing from the campfire. They were astonished, for fires don't light themselves. They'd only been away from the camp for a few minutes, and they could see all the way across the meadow, so they would have spotted someone coming. "Come on," Arthur said, running back to the tent. "Let's look in the grass. If anyone's been here, they'll have left tracks." But though they searched all around the camp, they could find only the tracks they had made themselves, going back and forth to the stream. Lucy was frightened, for it was odd to think of someone creeping up and lighting the fire, then vanishing without a trace. But she had an even bigger surprise when she noticed that the cans had been opened. "That's really spooky," Arthur said, examining them very carefully. "They haven't been opened with a can opener." "Then how have they been opened?" Lucy asked nervously. She could feel herself shiver. It was not yet dark, but the camp had become eerie. She felt a sudden urge to run back to the cottage, and yet somehow her legs wouldn't carry her. But then Arthur said something that made everything much better. "It must have been Nutmeg." Lucy felt her breath come back again. Of course it was her, for who else could it have been? She must have followed them from the cottage, and when she saw that they couldn't light the fire and that they didn't have a can opener, she must have crept up and put everything right. It would be just like her, Arthur said. "But how could she have opened the cans?" Lucy asked. Well, she's very small, isn't she?" The children had never set eyes on Nutmeg, and they did not know that she was a mouse. In her letters to them, she had called herself a fairy, so that's what they thought she was. And they knew how tiny she must be, for they had found a pair of her slippers in the dollhouse, and each was no bigger than a ladybug. "Oh, she'd have found a way," Arthur replied confidently. "Think of all the things she's done in Rose Cottage, sealing windows and lighting boilers and unblocking sinks. Opening a can of macaroni and cheese must have been easy compared to all that." "Where do you think she is now, then?" Lucy asked. "Oh, I don't know," Arthur shrugged. "I suppose she's hiding in the grass somewhere." "Goodness!" Lucy said, "and there we were thinking it must have been a ghost or something." "You might have thought so, but I don't believe in ghosts," Arthur said grandly. "Oh, all right, I know," Lucy replied. She was feeling much too relieved to argue about who believed in what. "Come on, now the fire's lit, we might as well have supper. I'm starving." The two children hurriedly set about preparing their food, for they had eaten nothing since lunch. But supper did not take long to prepare. They poked the fire with a stick, making a flat patch to cook on. Then they fried the sausages and eggs in oil and heated the macaroni and cheese in a saucepan. Everything got a bit burned, but when you're sitting by a campfire watching the sun sink over a meadow, even burned food doesn't taste too bad. As night gathered, the stream started to fill with black shadows, but when they looked back across the meadow, the children could still see Rose Cottage, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Presently a dim gleam appeared in the downstairs window as their father turned on the kitchen light. Suddenly, Lucy wished she was back in her comfortable attic bed. "Let's wash up in the morning. It's too dark now," she said when they had finished supper, and Arthur agreed, for he had also noticed how black the stream had become. It would be much too frightening to wash up in it now. "We might as well go to bed, seeing as it's getting dark," he said. Here's a picture of them cooking over the fire. "All right, but remember the tent's too small for two. You're sleeping on the grass," Lucy said teasingly. Arthur's face fell. "Oh, come on," she laughed. "We can both squeeze inside." The Nutmouses and the general, who were still finishing their enormous dinner, watched as Arthur and Lucy crawled into the tent. Arthur had turned his flashlight on, and they could see the children illuminated through the canvas. It was clearly a terrible squish. "Another sliver, anyone?" Nutmeg asked, offering around the cheese board. "Not for me, dear," replied Tumtum, who had eaten the lion's share of the pie and half the apple tart. "I don't know about you, but I'm ready to turn in. All this fresh air has gone to my head. And hadn't you better be getting home, General? Mrs. Marchmouse must be getting worried about you." "Oh, poppycock! Mrs. Marchmouse knows better than to worry about me," the general replied breezily. "If I'm not home by bedtime, just leave the door on the latch," I said. "So you see, Nutmouse, I am a free mouse tonight, and I intend to camp out here with you." Tumtum and Nutmeg looked taken aback. You have to be very fond of a mouse to let them share your tent. And fond as they were of General Marchmouse, they weren't as fond of him as all that. I'm afraid you would find it rather uncomfortable, General. Our tent is only equipped for 2, Tumtum said tactfully. Oh, fiddlesticks! I'm not going to sleep in that, the general replied. He stood up and pointed towards Arthur Toy's boat, Blue Bottle, which was standing beside the children's tent. I shall sleep in there. Don't be a fool, General, Tumtum said. Imagine if Arthur finds you on board. He might take you prisoner again. Not so long ago, the children had found the general exploring their dollhouse, and there had been terrible consequences, for they had put him in a biscuit tin, then taken him to their school, and rehoused him in a cage full of pet gerbils. The children had thought the general would be happy there, but in fact he had been miserable. And if the Nutmouses hadn't rounded up a troop of daredevil ballerinas to rescue him, he never would have escaped. You might have thought the general would have learned his lesson, but the sight of Blue Bottle had thrown him. Unbeknownst to the Nutmouses, he'd been dreaming about her all through supper. In his mind's eye, he could see himself as Blue Bottle's captain, coursing down the stream and harpooning salmon from the deck. Little Blue Belt had stirred a fierce longing in his heart. He had to spend the night on board. Do stop fussing, Nutmouse, he said, slinging his kit bag onto his shoulder. I won't let Arthur find me. I just want somewhere to lay my head until dawn. Then the general was gone. Well, if he wants to go, we can't stop him, Nutmeg said as they watched him disappear through the grass. Anyway, I can't see he'll come to much harm if he sleeps on Blue Bottle tonight. We'll just have to make sure he disembarks before the children wake up. I suppose so, Tumtum said. Couldn't face running after him now, for he was too tired for an argument. But the thought of the general strutting about on Arthur's boat made Tumtum very uneasy. While the Nutmouses retired to their tent, General Marchmouse stole on board. He climbed up Blue Bottle's finely crafted rigging and dropped down onto the moonlit deck, rubbing his paws with glee. At the sight of the toy cannon, the crow's nest, and the shiny wooden steering wheel, it was a proper old-fashioned war vessel, and he was in command. There he is, on Blue Bottle. With a trembling heart, he took out his flashlight and crept down the narrow stairs leading below deck. And here lay more delights, a storeroom full of plastic cannonballs, and a tin soldier, and a master cabin with a bed and dressing table and dresser. Everything was mouse-sized. The general sat down at the dressing table and preened his whiskers in the mirror, thinking what a handsome captain he would make. Then he closed his eyes and started to dream. He fancied he could hear the spray lashing his cabin window and the waves crashing on the deck. Oh, what adventures he could have if only he were out on the open water instead of being stuck here in the grass. It was all very frustrating. But then an idea came to him. It was a simple idea, but none the worse for that. Instead of creeping out of the boat first thing in the morning before the children woke up, he would simply stay on board. Arthur will never notice me. So long as I keep below deck, he thought. I'll hide under the bed while he carries the boat down to the stream. Then as soon as he's launched her in the water, I shall rush upstairs, tighten the sails, grab the wheel, and sail away as fast as the flow will carry me. I shall take the ship and phooey to anyone who tries to stop me. Delighted with his plan, the general stretched out on the captain's bed and drifted off to sleep. Chapter 5. Next morning, the Nutmouses awoke at dawn as the light began to fill their tent. I'll bring you a cup of tea, Tumtum yawned. Then he pulled on his robe and went outside to stoke the fire. It was a fine day, warm and cloudless, but there was a breeze rustling the grass. There was no sound of voices coming from the children's tent, and not a squeak from the general. Is anyone else up? Nutmeg asked when Tumtum returned with the tea tray. Not yet, he replied. Anyway, you know what the general's like. I remember when he was staying at Nutmouse Hall. He never got up before 9. Oh, gracious, Nutmeg said. I'd forgotten all about him. Well, we can't let him stay on Blue Bottle until 9. The children might find him. I know, but we'll have a hard time waking him, Tumtum said. He hates getting out of bed. Let's take him some breakfast. That should help him to get him going, Nutmeg suggested. All right, but we better hurry, Tumtum replied. I know it's early, but there's still a risk that the children will wake up. They quickly got dressed. Then Nutmeg fried some sausages while Tumtum prepared a thermos of coffee. When everything was ready, they packed it into the picnic camper and hastened toward the boat. There was a ladder dangling from the stern. They climbed up it, carrying the hamper between them, then scrambled over the railing onto the deck. The breeze was gathering and batting the sail, and as the mice made their way downstairs, they could feel the boat wobble. Here he is! Tumtum said, finding the general in the master cabin, stretched out luxuriously on the bed. Rise and shine, General, Nutmeg said cheerily, placing the hamper on the table. If you stay in bed any longer, your sausages will get cold. Leave me alone. I want to sleep, the general grunted. Well, you shall have to sleep elsewhere, Tumtum said sternly. If you stay here, the children will find you. Or worse still, they might not find you and launch the boat on the stream with you still in it. And you wouldn't want that, would you? The general opened one eye and looked at him crossly. Of course, this was exactly what he wanted, and it was awfully tiresome of Tumtum to interfere with his plans. The general rolled over and lay with his face to the wall, wishing they would go away. But then it occurred to him that if he was going to steal the boat, it would be much more fun if the Nutmouses came too. Now there's an idea, he thought. If I can keep them on board long enough, then we can all sail away together. What a jolly adventure that would be. He suspected the Nutmouses would not be keen on this plan, so he had to be very crafty. He turned over and watched as Nutmeg hurriedly unpacked the hamper and laid the table for breakfast. She kept looking through the porthole to check that the children hadn't emerged from their tent. Come on, General, come and have a sausage, she said. The general yawned and stretched each legged turn. Then he sat up and rose from his bed as slowly as he could. A fine morning, he drawled. Then he slouched across the dressing table and sat about grooming his chin. Do come and eat, General, Nutmeg said impatiently. But when he finally sat down at the table, he did not guzzle his food as he normally did. He ate very daintily, taking tiny mouthfuls and chewing each one for ages. So breakfast dragged on for a long time. I have appointed myself captain of this vessel, the general announced importantly, raising another crumb to his lip. You can be my first mate, Mr. Nutmouse, and you, Mrs. Nutmouse, he added generously, can be in charge of catering. Don't be silly, Tumtum said. This is Arthur's boat, and if we dilly-dally here much longer, he'll find us. Now come on, General, gather your things, and let's be off. Captain, the general corrected him. I am a captain now. Tumtum sighed. This was all too silly, but then Nutmeg pointed to the porthole and let out a shriek. The children are up! Tumtum grabbed the hamper and the Nutmouses rushed for the door. Hurry, General, Nutmeg pleaded, but the general just sat tight and went on eating. I shall not abandon my ship. You run along if you must, but I am staying here where I belong, and I don't care if Arthur sees me, he said. Tumtum and Nutmeg looked at him in astonishment. Could he not see what danger they were in? Don't be a fool, General, Tumtum began, but it was too late, for when they next looked back through the porthole, they could see Arthur's hand reaching toward the boat. Nutmeg let out a cry of terror. Then suddenly the floor lurched beneath them, and Blue Bottle soared into the air. The Nutmouses clung to a table leg as Arthur tucked the boat under his arm and carried it to the stream. They could see brief flashes of the ground through the porthole. It looked a horribly long way down. But the general showed no fear. He was elated. Everything was going just as he had planned. Hooray! We shall take command of the ship and race away downstream, he shrieked. Then all at once the boat started plummeting through the air. The mice braced themselves on the floor, and the next instant there was a violent smack as Blue Bottle hit the water. The stream was flowing fast. The boat surged forward, her mast tilting to starboard as she pulled away from the bank. Then she righted herself midstream and raced away with the current. We're away, the general cheered, rushing from the cabin. All hands on deck. For goodness sake, stay down here, or the children will see you, Tumtum shouted, but the general was already halfway up the stairs. Tumtum stumbled to the porthole and pressed his nose against the glass. He could see Arthur and Lucer chasing after them along the bank, but the stream was widening now, and Blue Bottle had been swept out of their reach. He looked down at the rushing water and felt a dread rising in his stomach. He staggered out of the cabin and followed the general up to the deck. Blue Bottle was going at a ferocious pace. There was spray cutting overhead, and the breeze was thrashing the sails. We must change course and steer back to the bank, Tumtum shouted, clinging to the mast. For pity's sakes, General, if we continue at this rate, we shall be swept out to sea. Hooray! Cried the general, who could think of nothing nicer. He tore across the deck and grabbed the steering wheel. He twisted it left, then right, and then left again, making the boat lurch violently. He had a mad look in his eyes. There he is at the wheel. Faster, faster, he squealed as the waves crashed upon the deck. You'll capsize us, you fool, Tumtum shouted. He made to grab the wheel, but the general clung on tight. Then followed the most desperate of scenes in which Tumtum tried to wrestle the general to the ground. It was real fisticuffs with pummeling and slugging and cries of pow and oof and ouch. But just as they were getting to full swing, the boat suddenly slowed down. almost to a halt, and gave a deep shudder. The mice stopped fighting and stood up, wondering what had happened. To their surprise, they saw that they had left the stream behind them, and now they were floating in a huge pool of still, clear water. "Gracious," Tumtum said, "we are in the pond." There was awe in his voice, for the pond was a wild place. It was bigger than a tennis court, and if, like Tumtum, you were only 2 inches tall, a tennis court would seem as big as an ocean. When a mouse stood on the pond's shore, he could not see to the other side, could only see a long blue horizon. As for what lay beyond the horizon, he could only guess, for no mouse had ever sailed across the pond before. It looked so big, no mouse had dared. But General March Mouse would change all that. "The pond," he whispered breathlessly. "I shall be the first mouse to explore it. I'll sail over the horizon and conquer whatever lies beyond. I shall discover foreign shores and name them all after me." The general felt a warm glow as he imagined how famous he would become. As the boat slowed, Nutmeg ran up onto the deck. She went to the railing and stood by Tumtum's side, gazing out in dismay at the endless ocean of water. Looking back, they could still just see the children on the bank, but they were becoming smaller and smaller. The boat had already drifted well out of their reach. Nutmeg turned very pale. "Turn us around, General," Tumtum pleaded. "We can't turn around now," the general retorted. "If we go back to the bank, the children will catch us, and you don't want that now, do you, Nutmouse?" He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. He knew the Nutmouses were at his mercy, and he had an expression of intense mischief on his face. Nutmeg looked back desperately at the bank, but it was far behind them now, and the children had become little dots in the distance. Gradually, the shore faded from sight, and in every direction, as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but water. "We are entering the unknown," whooped the general, punching a fist in the air. "This is madness. We've no compass and no clean clothes and virtually nothing left to eat," Tumtum protested. But the general had the scent of adventure in his nostrils, and nothing could stop him now. On and on he sailed, weaving blue wattle through the dragonflies and the algae toward where the sun glittered on a ceaseless horizon. Again and again the Nutmouses begged him to turn back. "There's nothing out there, General. We could sail on forever and never see dry land," Tumtum said, when they had been afloat nearly half an hour. But the general did not hear him. He had picked up his field glasses and was staring straight ahead, transfixed by something he had seen on the horizon. It was only a blur, and at first he fancied he might have been dreaming, but then little by little the object became sharper until there could be no mistaking what it was. For there, directly ahead of them, in those bleak, uncharted waters, lay an island, an unexplored island upon which he, the great General March Mouse, would be the first mouse ever to set foot. "I shall call it March Mouse Island," he thought feverishly. "My name will be on every map." He turned back to Tumtum, and Nutmeg cleared his lungs and shouted, "Land ahoy!" Chapter 6. The children stood for a long time on the bank, watching Bluebottle drift away. They had not seen the 3 mice on board, for they were hidden by the wooden railing encircling the deck. Eventually the boat reached the island and bumped to a stop. "You'll have to go in and get it," Lucy said. Arthur made a face. The water was full of weeds, and he could not see the bottom. "Why don't you go in?" he replied. "Because it's not my boat, and I wouldn't even if it was. I remember Pa saying the water was very deep. You'd have to swim to reach the island. Just think, if you open your mouth, you might swallow a frog." Arthur shuddered. He wasn't going to risk that. "So what shall we do? We can't just leave it here," he said, for Bluebottle was one of his favorite toys. "I wouldn't worry if I were you," Lucy replied. "It's bound to drift back to the bank eventually. We can come and check this afternoon. But now we better get a move on. We promised we'd be back for breakfast." Lucy suspected that her father would not notice if they broke this promise, but she wanted breakfast all the same. "Okay," Arthur said reluctantly, "but will you definitely come back this afternoon?" "Of course," Lucy said. They walked together back to the campsite and started packing everything away. They did not notice the Nutmouse's tent, nor their campfire, which was still burning away beneath the nettle clump, small as a penny. Meanwhile, Bluebottle's predicament was much worse than the children had feared. As the boat approached the island, the general had tried to steer her into a little pebbled cove he had spotted on the shore. But there was some litter drifting about, and when the boat was less than a ruler's length from the bank, she had collided head-on with a milk bottle that gouged a hole in her hull. The mice felt the deck heave as water started seeping into the hold. They had sprung a leak. It was a terrible disaster, but the general seemed remarkably unconcerned. "March, Mouse Island," he declared, blowing a kiss toward the shore, "and all discovered by me." "General, our boat is going to sink," Tumtum said pointedly. "Oh, never mind that," the general cried. "We shall have plenty of time to build another one. Now come on, let's go out and explore." Tumtum looked exasperated, but when he and Nutmeg went below deck to inspect the damage, they found the captain's cabin already flooding. There was nothing they could do. Bluebottle had been battered beyond repair. They retrieved the hamper and scurried back upstairs. "We're shipwrecked," Nutmeg said miserably. She turned a moment and looked back across the vast pond. The mainland was far from sight, lost beyond the horizon, and before them lay a wild, unknown shore. She shivered. Even the silence felt hostile to her now. She wondered if they would ever see Nutmouse Hall again. "Cheer up, my dear lady. We shall be shipwrecked in great style," the general said cheerfully. "We are the first settlers on this island, and we shall set the highest standards. We shall build a colossal villa. Villa Colossus we shall call it. And it shall have verandas and fountains and fancy colonnades. And we shall dine every night on fresh tadpole fillets roasted on an open fire." "Oh, poppycock," Tumtum said crossly. "The only thing we need to worry about is building a boat so that we can all get home." "All in due course, Nutmouse, all in due course," the general replied. "Our first priority is to chart out the island so that when we do return to our native land, we can tell everyone exactly what we found. Imagine how astonished our friends will be to learn that there's a whole new country right here in the pond." The general slung his rifle over his arm. Then he clambered over the side of the boat and slithered along the milk bottle to the shore. "The first settlers have arrived," he cried, marching onto dry land. All right. Well, he could not see the rest of the island, for the cove was ringed with a tall forest of bracken. He picked his way over the pebbles and dumped his satchel on a patch of moss. "We shall establish ourselves here. We can set up camp first and explore later," he declared. "All right," Tumtum said grudgingly, for if they were to be stuck on the island overnight, they would need somewhere to shelter. "Nutmeg and I will gather some twigs. Then we can make a lean-to," he said. "I want a villa, not a lean-to," the general replied stubbornly. Tumtum sighed. The general was being very difficult, but then Nutmeg solved the problem. "We shall make that your villa," she declared, pointing to an ice cream tub washed up on the far side of the cove. "It's pink," the general protested. But once they had dragged the tump over to the campsite and turned it upside down, even the general had to admit that it looked rather smart. It was tall and round like a tower, and there would be ample room for 3 beds inside. Tumtum hacked out a door and 2 windows using the bread knife from the picnic camper. Then he carried 3 pebbles inside to use as chairs. On the outside of the pot were the remains of a faded label that read "Vanilla." "We shall call it Villa Vanilla," the general said. It wasn't big enough to be a Villa Colossus. They would make one of those later. Presently Tumtum lit a fire, and Nutmeg prepared a late lunch from the odds and ends left in the hamper. It was a meager meal, for she rationed everything very strictly. They were each allowed 1 sausage roll, half a centipede pasty, and a chocolate mint for dessert. They were finished eating in no time. "Well then, General," Tumtum said, "we had better start building a boat." Now, Nutty," he replied, "I'm going exploring first. We can begin our boring old boat building tomorrow." "Well, don't be long," Tumtum said, "and if you fall down a mole-hole, don't expect us to come and rescue you." "Mole-hole, pah! I tell you, we're the first rodents on this island. I can feel it in my bones," General Marchmouse said confidently. Then he slung his satchel over his shoulder and strode into the bracken. The ferns were very thick, and it soon became so dark the general had to grope his way with his paws. But after a while the wood cleared, and he found himself at the foot of a steep bank covered in cow parsley. He started climbing, hoisting himself up by the plant stems until he came to a long, flat ridge. He was on the crest of the hill, high above the level of the pond. He could see the whole island stretched before him. And what a magnificent island it was! The coastline was wild and rugged and full of pebbled cliffs, and there were jungles full of thistles and bulrushes. In the middle of the island was a lake more than 2 feet long, surrounded by swaths of buttercups. The general peered through his field glasses, searching for any sign of habitation, but there was not a soul to be seen, not even a dragonfly. Everything was eerily still. He took a swig of water from his hip flask and prepared to press on toward the lake, hoping might at least unearth an exotic beetle or 2, but suddenly, in the corner of his eye, he saw something flickering. Then all at once there was a brilliant flash of light on the far corner of the island. He grabbed his field glasses and peered along the shore, trying to find where it had come from, but there was nothing there. He could just see the nettles rippling in the breeze. He looked again, searching the rushes along the water's edge, and then suddenly a dark shape appeared in his lens. He steadied his paws until he could see it clearly. It was a black ship with gold sails and the name Lady Crossbones painted in blood-red letters on its side. The general reeled back in horror. He knew to whom that boat belonged. The rats had arrived on Mouse Island. And that's the end of chapter 6. Stay tuned next week for chapter 7 to see what happens on Mouse Island when the rats arrive. Will Nutmouse and Tumtum and General Mouse be safe? Tune in next week. Bye.